Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the Puffin Cultural Forum and an ongoing series of interviews with noted writers. And today we have a very noted writer on a very intriguing and timely book. I'll get to that in a moment. First, let me just introduce myself. I'm Joseph Chuman. I am a part-time leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture, and I also teach part-time at the graduate program at Columbia University and at times at Hunter College. I've also taught for the United Nations, and my field is human rights. So I am interested from that angle and other angles, as will become apparent, of the book we're discussing this afternoon. My guest, let me introduce him, is Professor Eric Alterman, who's an award-winning journalist and CUNY, City University Distinguished Professor of English at Brooklyn College. He holds a PhD in U.S. history with a minor in Jewish studies from Stanford University. And many of us, of course, know Eric Alterman from his years as a columnist at The Nation magazine. Eric has written 11 books, and today we're going to be discussing his latest. Came out in November of last year. It's a magisterial volume, more than 500 pages, entitled "We Are Not One," subtitled "The History of America's Fight Over Israel." Eric Altman, welcome to the Puffin Cultural Forum.
Thanks. You know, I say I've written 12 books, but you're actually more accurate because I co-authored 2 books. So that if they equal 1, then I've only written 11.
Okay, right. Well, academic qualification and precision. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, my parents might see that.
Right. Okay. I'm sure they're very proud. Okay. My first question for you, with the huge number of books, endless number of books on Israel, Palestine, Israel and Jewish identity, why in the world did you commit yourself to writing yet another book on Israel?
Well, it's not about Israel. It's about the American debate over Israel.
Okay.
The history of that debate. I agree the world doesn't need another book about either Israel or the Israel-Palestinian conflict, or even the American relationship to Israel. That's done with. I mean, that's been done, so to speak. But I've always been interested in the discourse, not in a Foucauldian or Derridian sense, but I'm very interested in how public ideas end up being put into policy and affecting actual people's lives. Mm-hmm. And you know, as you implied, I've written a column. I wrote a column for 25 years for The Nation on the media. I've done it for another 2 years for the magazine American Prospect. So I know the media pretty well, and then this issue has been important to me. So I feel like I have been living with the issues that I discuss in this book, at least the issues for the past 25 years, for that entire period. And I feel like I know it as well as anyone in the world. And I feel like it's important. And one problem I've always had with the way politics is covered in this country in the media is that the role of the media is usually ignored. And it's very important. It shapes things. I mean, Thomas Friedman's enormously important in the history of U.S. relations with Israel, for instance. The New York Times is incredibly important, more so in a lot of ways than the State Department is. Mm-hmm. So I felt like I could put these issues together in a way that nobody had thought about it before, and also it's just kind of an obsession with mine, arguments over the things I care about, and to what degree they end up shaping the world. So I took what I think is a unique approach to this, and even though I think I say in the introduction, I think I say in the very first sentence of the book, if I'm not mistaken, it might be, that my shelves are literally groaning from right. The books I've collected right. Over the course of decades on Israel and Palestine and Israel itself. There isn't any other book like this. And again, there's no other book I'm as well qualified to write. So now that's just about me. The other reason I thought this book would be useful is for 2 reasons. One is, I don't know if this has been your experience, but in my experience, it's almost impossible to discuss Israel-Palestine with anyone, right, unless they share exactly your assumptions, which almost right. No one does. Right. Because the issue is so often one of personal identity rather than intellectual investigation, that people just get mad at each other, and it immediately devolves into whataboutism. And nobody ever convinces anybody of anything. It just gets into nasty arguments. And the other reason I wrote this book, which, as you mentioned, is over 500 pages, is because everything about it is really complicated. You can't do justice to anything. This is true of most things having to do with Jews, but you can't do justice to anything having to do with Israel and Palestine. Is it settler colonialism? You know, it's complicated. Is it apartheid? It's complicated. Was there a nakba? Yes, but what does that mean for the rest of Israeli history and Palestinian history? The whole thing's very complicated, and Twitter and even magazines like the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books, they can do justice to small parts of it. But I wanted to tell the whole story in this way, so I did.
Yeah, well, let me just pick up on that because I think it's an exceedingly commendable and necessary approach. I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so fraught and so basically consumed and stuck in polemics. It seems as if, in your approach, you've dedicated yourself to getting beyond those polemics by providing an incredible compendium of facts, details, and nuance. So I'm wondering, in effect, as a historian, what your aim is there. I mean, you've given us a hint at that. If you can elaborate on your editorial line, your approach, and your objectives in putting all these facts together in a historical, it's really chronologically organized to a great extent.
I don't know that I had a single aim. Like I said, I felt like I'd been living with this conflict in my head for 40 years. I felt like there were parts of it I could tell better than anyone else. And I guess really my aim relates to what I just mentioned, which is that I've been involved in so many different arguments and called so many names by so many different sides of people, that I felt like, to do justice to what I truly understand about the conflict and what I've learned since writing the book, of course, which is a lot more than when I started, and to its complexity, that I would go on record and say, here's what I understand to be true, and here's the evidence. And if you don't like it, show me better evidence, and I'm open to that. I learned a lot from this book. I changed my mind about certain things.
Okay.
And that's really all it was. I felt, you know, when you write a book, you just want to. I just write books where I feel like that's why I want to spend my time. You know, that's what I do, is write books.
Good.
So this book really worked in that respect, even though it's very frustrating to read a lot of this stuff. I felt like I had a role to play that nobody else could fill. That sounds arrogant, but I said it.
Okay. Well, as a reader, it seemed to me, in my interpretation of what you've written, and of course every book lends itself to interpretation, that there are several actors and phenomena on which you center your narrative, organize it. Among them are the image of Israel in the American mind, particularly the American Jewish mind, and that, in effect, has changed over the last 75 years. Second is the role, and you spend a lot of time talking about this, Eric, the role of the right-wing Jewish establishment, so to speak, as manifest by such organizations as AIPAC, the Zionist Organization of America, the President's Organizations of major Jewish organizations, and so forth. Okay, in terms of Israel, if we can look at these themes, in terms of Israel in the American mind, you interestingly, very interesting to my view, spent a chapter talking about the formative role of the iconic book Leon Uris's Exodus, and the subsequent film produced by Otto Preminger starring Paul Newman, the film of that name, in terms of very early on. I guess it was the early 50s when that book came out.
It was the book was 58 and the movie
50,
was 1960.
61. Okay, so it was still
60.
early within 13 years of Israel's founding. That in effect that book sort of helped to format the American and the American Jewish image of what Israel was all about. Okay, now that's changed, but could you talk a little bit about the role of the book and the movie
It's an amazing story, really, because,
and how it was mythological?
First of all,
in your
it's a
view?
it's a bad book. And yet Leon Uris, when he set out to write that book, he said, I'm going to write a new chapter of the Bible. Mm-hmm. And he came pretty close to succeeding. There are a lot of people I quote in the book, rabbis and so forth, saying more secular Jews, and this is true of where I grew up, had that book on their shelves than had the Bible. And the Israelis saw it as a fantastic propaganda boon. The Golda Meir, who was the I think foreign minister at the time under David Ben-Gurion, said, we can shut down the entire public affairs office now that we have this book. And that was before the movie. What it did was it presented, I mean, it's, again, I could, every one of these questions we could spend the entire hour on. The Holocaust was an incredibly wrenching experience for American Jews because they felt so helpless. And they learned what was happening and they didn't feel like they could do anything about it. And they felt incredibly guilty living in enormous comfort while, the most horrific thing in history was happening to the Jews in Europe. And on the other hand, the Zionists were building this new civilization, the first Jewish Commonwealth in 2,000 years, and they were fighting and farming and loving and speaking Hebrew and writing novels in Hebrew, and they were reinventing the Jewish people in a way that thrilled the American people, American Jews, whereas the Holocaust was seen as shameful as well as horrific because Jews went like lambs to the slaughter. That was part of the Zionist narrative. So there was this new Jew that American Jews could invest themselves in. There was actually a fight between Philip Roth and Leon Uris about like whether or not American Jews were contemptible because they went to psychiatrists and went to dentists and were insurance agents and that kind of thing instead of fighting Arabs. And in the movie Exodus, the Arabs are actually joined by Nazis. Uris didn't have the nerve to do that. Anyway, this Paul Newman, this glistening, shirtless Paul Newman, who, by the way, his father was Jewish. He and the other people who played the Jews in the movie, they represented the absolute ideal of American Jews, something they could never be, but something they could look up to and admire and build on for the future. And they also love the idea of this being presented to the world as this is Israel and the new Jew. And so they became completely invested in this fantasy in a way that is remarkable. And then when the 67 war happened, it seemed as if the fantasy had been not only come true, that Israel had kicked the Egyptians' ass in 6 days, just like God, 6 days, and creating the world. And not only were the Israelis these magnificent warriors who, by the way, wrote poetry when they got home at night and worked the fields in the morning, made love in between at some point. I don't know exactly when. But God had intervened back in Jewish history with this 6-day war, and American Jews ended up giving over virtually their entire identity as Jews to the degree that the Jewish part of them was their identity to love and support for Israel. But it was an Israel that never existed. It existed only in the movies and in propaganda.
Well, okay, in what sense? Of course, it's a movie, and all movies divert from facts. They appeal to fantasy. But to what extent was the Leon Uris depiction not an accurate depiction? I mean, clearly,
Well,
to some
nothing
degree it
about it
wasn't.
is
But
accurate.
well, okay, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the story he tells of the Exodus ship is about an entirely different ship. But leaving that aside, the most egregious thing is that in the story he tells, the Jews are constantly reaching out to the Arabs and saying, we want to live in peace with you as equals, and we can build this land together. And the Arabs are basically subhuman. And the only thing they understand is violence, and they rape and pillage, and their children are smelly and stupid, and they just have no redeeming quality. They're subhuman, and like I said in the movie, they're even allied with Nazis. And so in fact, I found a document from the Israeli military. I'm not the world's greatest sleuth in archives. Somebody else actually found it and told me about it. Where the IDF took credit for expelling 700,000 Arabs from Israel before the war even began. So there were only approximately 750,000 Arabs left. So basically, nobody really knows the figures exactly. Everybody's guessing. But most of the Arabs who left, which is about 60% of them, were expelled. They did not leave because they were told on imaginary radio broadcasts for decades.
Right.
You heard about these radio broadcasts telling the Arabs to leave, and then they come
Yes,
right back.
I grew up on that in my
Yeah, so did
childhood.
I.
That was the story, that
There's
the
no evidence
Arabs
for it at all.
basically told the Palestinians to leave. They would invade, they would destroy the Zionist entity in its cradle, and then they would return. That was
Right.
the official myth. But clearly, people fled wars as they always flee wars, and there was what I would call Israel's original sin in that regard, in terms of the expulsion of the massacres, destruction of hundreds of villages, and so forth that went on.
Right. It was
Yeah,
a very chaotic thing. I mean, there was a plan to expel all the Arabs that was never put into place.
right,
But the individual commanders were given the option of doing it if they felt it necessary for military purposes. So you can go to Lod, where the
right,
airport is, and that used to be an Arab village.
right.
And there's no Arab, it's now the Israeli airport.
Mhm.
But next door to it is an Arab village that didn't,
Right.
where the people didn't get expelled. So this story is not really convenient for either side, like all 512 pages of my book.
Right.
It's not all the Arabs were expelled. Some did leave voluntarily. We don't know how many. Many stayed. There were I think 150,000 Arabs left when the war was over. The thing I learned that saddened me, I went into this book thinking that, as the historian I really admired named Zev Sternhol used to say, that Israel was a good little country before 1967, and it ended up getting corrupted by the occupation, which I think that part's true. But the Israeli Arabs were always treated terribly. And again, if I were discussing this with someone who was in the pro-Israel camp, they would say, well, Israel had good reason for this, and perhaps they did. They were likely to ally themselves with Israel's enemy, and Israel was very insecure, literally, physically insecure, and didn't know how to handle it. But the two things that most people don't know, I didn't know this myself, was that number one, until 1966, all of the Arabs in Israel lived under martial law,
Hmm.
and they needed a passage to go from village to village, so they were not free. And second, the Arabs who were either expelled or left of their own volition immediately lost all their land, and their land was expropriated by the Israeli state and belonged to the Israeli state according to a law that Israel passed in 1950. So that doesn't seem very right. That's not fair to take people's land because after you expel them. So a lot of other things are contestable, but that's not. So that saddened me, because I thought that before the occupation, Israel was on a road to being a democratic country that included all of its citizens. 20% of Israelis are Arabs, and it was going to be like an Israeli society rather than a Jewish dominated
Well,
society.
the Declaration of Independence sort of veers in that direction.
Yeah, they have a very nice
It
Declaration of Independence,
it's an enlightened document.
but the
Yeah,
reality was not that,
right.
and this is something that you never read about in the American press ever.
Right. Okay. Now, in addition to the movies and Exodus and so forth, you talk about, as a journalist and somebody who writes about journalism, about the role of journalism in promoting the Israeli image in the early years. Let's talk about it prior to 67. And you also focus, and I think it's important, on the New York Times as the paper of record, and yet the role of the New York Times and its stance towards Israel was ambivalent. I'm wondering if you can talk, as somebody who reads the New York Times every day, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of the New York Times vis-a-vis Israel in framing its image of
I could
American
write a whole
media.
book about the role of the New York Times in Israel. Um, I'm sort of tempted to. Just last week, I don't know when we're airing, but just last week, the New York Times ran an editorial saying that Israeli democracy was on the line because of the new Begin government.
Yes.
And Begin responded by attacking the New York Times and calling it out for its anti-Israel, anti-Semitic position that it had when Israel was founded. and that's true. Uh, the original Sulzberger, Arthur Sulzberger, I think it's Arthur Oakes Sulzberger, the
Yes.
the great grandfather of Arthur Sulzberger, who just retired. Maybe it's his grandfather. Um, he was, by his own admission, a self-hating Jew and incredibly anti-Zionist. And he didn't want. He was very worried about the Times being perceived as a Jewish newspaper. And interestingly, both the New York Times and the United States State Department, which was also quite anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic, they treated the Israeli anti-statists, the left-wing group called Ichud, which was quite distinguished in its membership. It had Hannah Arendt Latir, but it had Yehuda Magnus, this famous rabbi. It had who wrote Martin Buber. It had Henrietta Zold, the founder of Hadassah, and many intellectuals, and much support here, including Hannah Arendt and Albert Einstein, and my friend Izzy Stone. They said their position was there should be no Israel until the Arabs agree that there should be an Israel, so we can work things out and peacefully. We don't want to have a war. We don't want to impose ourselves on anyone. And that position had no corollary at all on the Arab side. It never has. And eventually it had no support at all among Jews, although it started out with some, but it ended up with none, particularly when war came. But the State Department and the New York Times continued to treat it like it was a viable idea and to try to strengthen it. And the New York Times correspondent in Palestine and Israel was actually a member of that organization, as was, by the way, this is even more amazing, commentaries correspondent in Israel. Mm-hmm. So this position had a lot more in the early years of Israel. It had a lot. It got a lot more attention than it deserved in terms of having any support in Israel or in American Jewry. Actually, it had very little support there, except among these intellectuals. Now, eventually, the New York Times, like most of the American media, moved over to a very pro-Israel position. That took some time. It took more time with the New York Times than it did with most journalist organizations. But look, there was this heroic story. It was after the Holocaust. It was thrilling. It was told in biblical terms. And plus, the Israelis were an incredibly attractive people if you ignored the fact that the Palestinians had been expelled, and everyone was willing to ignore it. I mean, the reason you got all that terrorism in the 1970s, and I'm not justifying, but I'm explaining, the Palestinians were saying, "Hey, we exist. We're here. We you forgot all about us. We're going to make you remember us. And if this is the only way we can do it, we're going to do it that way." Again, I wouldn't have done that if I were them, but I don't think that was a good thing. But it's understandable that they felt the world had forgotten about them, because the world did forget about them. Golda Meir is famously quoted saying, "Who are the Palestinians? They do not exist." And that was a triumph. She was right at that time. And that was a triumph of the Israeli narrative that was passed through the American Jewish establishment and the American media.
Okay, let's talk about how that narrative changes. 1967, the Six-Day War was the watershed event, right? Israel preemptively attacked Egypt and so forth because they were correctly believed, held to the view that the Arab states were going to invade, which they did. And Israel basically beat them back. They unified Jerusalem. They took over Sinai and Golan and the West Bank and Gaza and so forth. And I think religious Jews saw it as the hand of God. It was divine. It sort of created a sense of triumphalism among Orthodox Jews. It was a type of miracle. I mean, for the first time in 2,000 years, Jerusalem was under the hegemony of the Israelis and so forth. It was an amazing thing. But that was a watershed event in terms of an understanding of Israel. I mean, you had the New Left at the time in the 60s that basically aligned Israel as a colonial with the colonialism and imperialism, saw the Palestinians as oppressed third world peoples. You had that tremendous international schism in the United Nations and between the, the imperial powers in the third world, and so on and so forth. And you had the new left, basically, and many many leaders of whom were Jewish, basically looking at Israel through a very negative lens at that point and sympathizing with the Palestinians. So it seems to me that you had a divide. We're not talking about the Orthodox here, but in the non-Orthodox Jewish American diaspora, a divide in terms of how Israel was appreciated at that time. In the '67 war, I think, was the watershed event. Could you elaborate on that? I mean, is that
Yeah,
accurate?
I'm gonna add a few caveats to what you said.
Sure. Okay, go ahead.
Number one, I'm not sure that Egypt and Syria were going to attack Israel. I don't think the Israelis actually thought they were either,
Okay. No.
but they thought they might. I mean, they certainly said they were going to, and they thought they might. There's a good chance they would. And Israel was paralyzed economically by its readiness, and so it needed to launch the war because it couldn't remain ready and economically sustainable for that long. So Israelis knew they were going to win that war, and the United States knew that Israel was going to win the war. Israel was trying to get the United States permission to attack first, and the United States said, "Don't attack first, and don't expect us to help you, and don't worry about it. You don't need our help. You're going to kick their ass. Just make sure you're not the first to attack." So they waited to be attacked. It's not clear that they were. I mean, it's very confusing what actually happened. But okay, so leaving that aside, that's an argument for historians. It doesn't really matter anymore. As far as the effect of 1967, you're right that a lot of the Orthodox completely changed their view. They had been anti-Zionist. They were said it's the business of the Messiah to restore the Jews to Israel. But this requires a lot of explanation. But they came up with an explanation that even though these Zionists, who they hated for being anti-religious and looking down on them, that the Zionists didn't understand that they were actually the agents of God, and that's how Israel was being restored. So it was okay to support Israel. And in fact, this restoration of this land, the land itself became holy, which is where the Gush Emanim came in and created this whole movement that has led to the settlements in occupied territories. Now, I wouldn't endorse what you said about the schism among American Jews. I think, first of all, I think both conservative and reform American Jews, and if you look at the sermons of their rabbis in synagogue, they also thought that God intervened. They talked about this as if God was playing a role, and this became actually their official position. And if you ask them exactly how and what does that mean about God, they wouldn't really have gotten an answer. But they were so afraid. There was all this talk of the second Holocaust, and they were so terrified. And then this magnificent victory where Israel doubles its size and conquers Jerusalem, as you say, and no one could believe it at the time. They were so ill prepared for that outcome that they really thought it was a miracle, and that God was again playing a role in history. And this is true of my understanding of it. There's no way to prove this, but it's true of most Jews. Now, on the left, there was a schism. On the far left, there was a schism.
That's what I was
in the new left,
actually,
because Israel did have some defenders in that. But you're right that the new leftist position became that Israel was an imperialist nation, and that the Arabs were part of the revolutionary vanguard, like the Vietnamese, like the Algerians, like the Cubans, and that if you wanted to be a good leftist, you had to be anti-Israel. And this was also connected to the black struggle in the United States, Black Power, Black Panthers, etc. And it led to this eventual schism between blacks and Jews, because black leaders and black politicians were sort of alone in supporting the Palestinians among well-known American politicians. And still, Barack Obama was actually rather unique in so many ways. So one of them was that he connected the struggle of the Jews to create Israel and the state of Israel to survive to the civil rights struggle, whereas
Right.
most black leaders
Well, so
connected
did
to
Martin.
Palestinians.
Yeah, if I may mention, Eric, so did Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was a professed Zionist.
Yes, yes.
That's right. Yes, he was. Right. I'm sorry. Go
Yeah.
ahead. Yeah.
No, that's true. There was a piece in the New York Times recently by I think Michelle Alexander. Yes, I'm sure of that.
Hmm.
Saying today King would support the Palestinians. Like that's something that's sticking in the craw of many leftist black leaders. But yeah, King was a Zionist, and then Jesse Jackson is the figure who is the transitional figure from pro-Israelism to anti-Israelism on the part of black leadership in the United States.
Okay, let's take this theme and jump forward to today, though. That was 67, but today, I mean, the argument is made, and I'm a progressive, and I don't stand in lockstep with the severe criticism of Israel. I don't support BDS and so on. I support the state of Israel. I don't support the occupation. But in effect, Israel has now become, in segments of the progressive movement, and then the Democratic Party seems to increasingly move in this direction, is to basically change change face on Israel, and is becoming critical of Israel as an oppressor, a colonial power, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
That seems to be gaining traction. And as a result, young people care less about Israel. And if they do care about it, they care about it in negative terms. Yes?
I just have to take profound issue with one part of what you just said,
Okay.
which is where you include the Democratic Party. That's just not true. The Democratic Party is still very much pro-Israel and is largely marching in as much lockstep with Israel as it ever has.
Yes, but around the edges, you begin to have talk.
Well,
Don't
that's
you,
not the
party
Democratic Party. That's
okay.
Look, the vote. Barack Obama signed a memo of understanding giving a historically unprecedented memo of understanding between any two nations in history to give Israel $3.8 billion a year for the next 10 years, $38 billion in aid, which is law. Like,
Right.
nothing anybody can do anything about it. So and they hated Barack Obama.
Yeah, I want to talk about that.
No, let me finish this thought.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eric. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
So then Israel has this little war in Gaza against Hamas last year. And they say they spend about $1 billion shooting down missiles with the Iron Dome system. Now, that's what the money was for.
Right.
But Congress decides, well, they shouldn't have to use it for what it was for. We need to give them another $1 billion to replace the money that they spent so they can have what they started out with. And what was that vote? There are 538 members of Congress. There were 9 votes against. Okay. So AOC abstained. There were 8 votes against and 1 abstention. AOC abstained. 8 Democrats voted against it. So that's what the Democratic Party is. Okay, 8 votes against.
No, I don't doubt that. I'm just saying that you begin to hear noises in parts of the Democratic Party that are basically singing a different tune. But clearly,
you always did. You always did.
Okay, but
Jim
let me get
Zogby
back.
was a senator.
Yeah, I do want to ask you, though. I mean, there's so much we could talk about, but you did have an entire chapter on Barack Obama. And this is one thing I really don't understand. As you point out, Barack Obama was, quote, a true friend of Israel, as if countries really have friends and not allies. But he was launched into his career with the help of Jewish advocates and friends in Chicago. He defined himself, as you point out, and I didn't know this, as the first liberal Jewish president. And he basically vouchsafed billions of dollars for Israel. And I believe you don't mention this, but you're mentioning it now, the Iron Dome that shoots down these crazy missiles from Gaza was basically a gift by the Obama administration to Israel. I don't understand the relentless contempt that the Israelis had for Barack Obama and the American Jewish establishment, which supports right-wing Israeli policy and the government. I don't quite understand the condemnation of Barack Obama. He basically was an ally and a friend, a staunch friend to Israel. And if you can, add a footnote to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter in the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty basically ensured that almost half the Arab world, Egypt is almost half the Arab world, was then at peace with Israel. You would assume that would be a tremendous gift for which the Israelis and their allies in America would be endlessly grateful. And yet these two people are condemned relentlessly. I want you to explain. I don't understand the vitriol in that regard. I've never understood.
You said it very well. Um, you know, I do I explain it in the book? I certainly portray it.
Hmm.
I mean, the it look, there's a split among American Jews that began really in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon, where American Jews started for the first time criticizing Israel openly and and showing some sympathy for the Palestinians. And since then, it's been kind of an internal civil war in the American establishment. And Barack Obama was on the wrong side of that war from the standpoint of the Israelis and the people who were attacking him. So when you say he grew up around Jews, well, he as a young man, it's true, but his closest advisor about Israel and Jewish issues was a rabbi whose synagogue was across the street, named Arnold Jacob Wolf,
Hmm.
who was the founder of a group called Bray Ra, which in
Right.
1973, a founder, which in 1973 was the very first group of rabbis and non-clerical, non-rabbis to criticize Israel and say we have to make peace with the Palestinians. So he was the enemy. So he was the guy who broke the united front of always supporting Israel and never criticizing it in public. It's okay to criticize in private, but never in public. So Barack Obama had the wrong friends among Jews, and he spoke with great sympathy about the Palestinians when none of these people wanted to hear that, as did Jimmy Carter. So yes, Jimmy Carter did more for Israel than any president, but Harry Truman. Harry Truman recognized the state of Israel, and Israel probably wouldn't have been possible without it. But you're right. Israeli security since the Camp David agreements has allowed for planning no wars with Egypt. And that changed everything. That allowed them to act as however they please with regard to the Palestinians and the Syrians and Lebanese, etc., because they don't have to worry about going to war with Egypt. And the American Jews hated him for what he did. Same with Barack Obama. Now, with Obama and the Israelis, things are a little different. Again, they didn't feel that Obama was on their side, even though what they mean is he's not on our side enough. But also by this time, Israel had clearly become a right-wing country. I've said this many times. Israel is a red country. American Jews are a blue country. Israel is the only country in the quote-unquote democratic world that prefers Donald Trump to both Obama and Biden, and it's not even close.
You said 70% of Israelis support Donald Trump.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
and actually, it's about the same thing in the other direction for American Jews. So throughout this whole period, American Jewish politics and culture has been in great tension with their support for Israel, because the people who support the Palestinians attack this position as PEP, progressive except Palestine. But let's just say there was a tension there, and now that tension has come out into the open, because the Israeli government has now embraced this naked form of racist contempt for Arabs and also contempt for American Jewish religious practices, and liberalism itself. And so now this tension is actually going to is actually going to spill into actual hostility. And the people in the middle, the American Jewish organizations, are the people who've been saying all these years, there is no tension. Is the people who say Israel is not a liberal country, that Israel's mistreating the Palestinians, are liars. The Palestinians have the best lives of anybody in the Arab world. You're an anti-Semite if you take issue with this. Those people can no longer make that case anymore. And they're stuck with saying, look, you support Israel because we support Israel. And if you don't, then you can leave the room. And
Okay.
that's
Yeah.
actually a position of the Christian conservatives more than the American Jews, far more than the American Jews.
Yes. Well, I
So,
want to talk. I want to talk about all those issues. I mean, one main theme that you basically come back to again and again and again and again is the advocacy support, which is untrammeled, exceptionless, and totally absolute of the right-wing Jewish American, let me use the word establishment, advocates of Israel, the nationalist wing, how they brook absolutely no criticism of Israel whatsoever. The slightest whimper of criticism that Israel has done something wrong, or they've violated the rights of Palestinians, or they've been abusive, or the occupation, you can't even use the word occupation, and somehow is excessive and oppressive. Any word, in effect, you're over. I mean, you mentioned Brera. I had friends who were involved in Brera, and that organization was destroyed
Yes.
by the right-wing Jewish establishment in America. The slightest whimper, and of course, you're named an anti-Semite. I'm wondering, when does that term grow stale? I mean, how many times can you play that card, which is vacuous in many cases, and get away from it? I mean, get away with it. At what point will the right-wing Jewish establishment begin to erode and lose credibility simply in the face of hard evidence? Okay.
Yeah.
Now, again, I'm not saying the Palestinians are angels. I'm not saying that terrorism is a concern. I mean, you've got 100,000 Hezbollah missiles pointing at Israel. There are real issues there. I realize it's, as you point out, complex and nuanced and so forth. But the point you make is the obdurateness, the sheer obdurateness of the right-wing Jewish establishment. I'm wondering if you can talk about that, and whether, in effect, it will continue as it is, or begin to be chipped away at the edges because of realities that are no longer deniable.
Well, I don't like to predict anything too far into the future.
No, nobody can predict the future.
The part I'm willing to predict
Right.
is that the American Jewish establishment organizations are not going to change. Although, like AIPAC, I wouldn't call that a Jewish organization. It's when people say the Jewish lobby, sometimes they're attacked as anti-Semites. They're just really out of date. I mean, Bibi Netanyahu used to call it the Jewish lobby. He's on tape doing that. But it's AIPAC represents much more the Christian conservatives' view of Israel than it does the Jews. J Street's view of Israel is much closer to the majority of American Jews. There are a lot of Jews who support AIPAC, but AIPAC really speaks for its funders rather than for the American Jewish community, as does the ADL. Now, here's as far as I'm willing to predict. I think that American Jewry is in crisis for a lot of reasons, but it's in crisis because ever since 1967, it has defined itself vis-a-vis its support for Israel and its sacralization of the Holocaust.
Yes.
Period. Irving Kristol, he's on record saying, Judaism for me is Israel and the Holocaust, period. Now, the Holocaust was a long time ago, and there have been a lot of other horrible things that have happened since. That's made it seem less unique and searing. And also, there's hardly anybody to talk about it anymore. You know, nobody's grandparents are really around anymore who recall it. And Israel is, of course, nothing like the Israel of Exodus, that the heroic Israel that was sold to people of my generation, and I suppose your generation. I mean, I accepted that definition when I was young. So whither American Jewry? Well, it spent the past 50 years with this definition that doesn't work anymore. So why be Jewish if you're a young person who has the choice, which American Jews do? And there's not a good answer. The answer they give today is anti-Semitism. That's not a very attractive answer. That goes back to an argument that Jean-Paul Sartre made back in 1945, that the only thing keeping Judaism alive is anti-Semitism. It was wrong then, and it's wrong today. But unless you embrace the religion and religious teachings or the history and culture, for me, it's all about the history and literature and culture, but that's a lot of work. Most people don't even know it exists. So what's going to happen is that Judaism is going to continue to die secularly. The Orthodox will continue to grow. Right now, I read a statistic. I can't stand by it because I don't have it in front of me, but 40% of the Jewish babies born in New York City are Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox. So right now, Jews have never been very religious. 20% of Jews go to shul every week, and 10%, half of those are Orthodox. So 10% go. Conservative Jewry has lost 33% of its membership in about the last 15 years. Reform Jewry has lost 18%. It would have lost more, except it's gotten some of the conservatives. who are like moving down a step in terms of their religiosity. Young people are more disaffected from Israel than are their parents and grandparents, and much less likely to join Jewish institutions. So as far as I'm willing to predict is that the American Jewish organizations are not going to change because they are responsible not to American Jews, but to the funders. And those funders are conservative and Republican quite frequently. That's why AIPAC endorsed 109 Republicans with its PAC in the last election, including 108 of them. 108 of those 109 were election deniers. The 109th was Lynn Cheney, who they did not endorse initially. They had to be embarrassed into doing it. So that's not a Jewish organization anymore. That's an organization that represents conservative right-wing position, many of which are supported and funded by Christian conservatives. So the Jewish establishment, which is answerable to this small group of the 25% of Jews who are Republicans and the Christian conservatives, they can't change because they need to sustain their organizations, and that's who pays for them. But American Jews, particularly young American Jews, can walk away unless these institutions find a way to rejuvenate themselves. And that's, again, I wrote the first 450 pages of this book as a historian, but in the end, I say this is a real concern of mine. I think I've been studying Jewry and American Jewish history, American Jewish culture. I teach it now also. It's incredibly rich and wonderful and thrilling. I mean, Philip Roth and Saul Bellow and Woody Allen. I like Woody Allen. I'm sorry, and Larry David and Tony Kushner. You know, it's an incredible flowering of cultural renaissance, and it doesn't have to apologize for itself the way Leon Uris demanded that it did, and people ignore it because it's not heroic in the way Israel appeared to be, but it's going to die out. Right now, that's definitely dying. And all the money that goes towards Israel, you know, the Birthright program has raised $50 billion. And that money just about all goes to Israeli institutions, including especially the Israeli military. I would like to see some of that money invested in American Jewish institutions for educational purposes, for the purpose of tikkun olam, and most importantly, for the purposes of figuring out what does it mean to be a diaspora Jew in the 21st century, one whose identity is not tied up with Zionism, because Zionism is increasingly difficult for diaspora Jews to identify.
Right. Well, it's very well said. And I think in many ways, one would argue, looking at the facts, it's unarguable. I want to add, unfortunately, we're going to have to bring this to a close. I wish we had hours to talk about this, Eric. It's absolutely important and fascinating. I want to talk to you about Zionism again, and the criticism of Zionism is basically to attack Israel and Zionism per se anti-Semitic. Now, I think the answer is no, but the question is, how do you tease that apart? I mean, I would argue that the world has always had and continues to have a very unhealthy fascination with Jews. Okay. And it seems to me that some of the criticism of Israel and Zionism per se is a mask for anti-Semitic sentiment that lies beneath. The problem is you can't really be sure. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about that is. Are there telltale signs of the critique of Israel and Zionism that you feel are compellingly anti-Semitic at their core? Are there signs that tell us that? Because I don't know, and so forth. But I'm wondering what your thinking is about that.
Well, first of all, I can't wave a magic wand, but if I could, I would remove the word Zionism from this debate, because I think Israel is a settled fact. I don't think it makes sense to argue whether or not there should be an Israel or shouldn't.
Right. No, of course.
Because there is an Israel, and it's not going anywhere. The idea that there's going to be a Palestine from the river to the sea is ridiculous, and it's an example of how terrible the Palestinians are at politics.
Well, some people today have revived a single state solution, right, where we get rid of a Jewish state and have a binational or combined state.
Right, but none of those people can actually tell you how it's going to happen.
That's correct.
I'm a relatively conservative liberal. In some ways, I'm a Marxist, but I'm also a conservative liberal, although maybe this is Marxism. Because if you tell me, here's what the policy I support, I say, well, that's nice. How are you going to get there? And if they can't tell me how they're going to get there, it doesn't interest me in the slightest.
Mhm.
So the whole BDS movement, I don't like it. I don't like a lot of things about it. And there are a bunch of people in it who are motivated by anti-Semitism. But I would support it if I thought it could end the occupation and help Palestinians and Israelis to live in peace and civility. But I know it can't. I know that it can only make things worse. It has no theory of how it can actually work. It's really fashion statement. It's a political fashion statement. No one in the BDS movement can actually explain to you how they're going to convince Israel to give up their country and give it up to people they consider to be their enemies, who are much weaker than they are and have lost 14 wars. It's inconceivable. You need divine intervention for that to happen, and that's not going to happen either. So the question is so leaving all that aside, you say, look, the world has always been filled with anti-Semitism, and it always will be. But it's kind of besides the point when you're discussing Israel, because it really doesn't matter what a person's motivations are. It matters how good is their case and what is their evidence. So if you're a Palestinian, you have a pretty good argument for being quote unquote anti-Zionist. And if you think the Palestinians have gotten a raw deal from history, and I was once inside a Palestinian refugee camp where my life was actually threatened. The Israeli soldiers let me in and said, "You're crazy for going in there." And they were right. And that was in 1988. So I was already there 2 generations after those people had lost their land. So I was there with the grandchildren of the people who had been forced to leave. That was 88. So now their grandchildren are living there. And as far as we know, those people's grandchildren will still be living here. I don't think that's right. Okay, I think that's terrible. I don't think we should accept that. And other people who think that, it just seems to me to be common sense that it's unfair that Israel should have such a lovely, wonderful country and the Palestinians should have nothing when it was their land. It's unfair, in my view, that I can go live in Israel and a Palestinian can't, even though their family owned the land before they left or were forced to leave. So those issues, saying these things, do not make one anti-Semitic. I mean, you can't argue that I'm anti-Semitic. I'm a Jew. I'm a real Jew. So to me, it's a way of not dealing with the issue itself. It's a way of avoiding the issue by demonizing one's opponent. And it's also a way of playing whataboutism. Well, what about these people who are anti-Semitic? To take the attention away from the injustice of the issue. Now, I'm not one of those people who thinks that injustice is a sufficient argument to change the world. Power is very important too, and these Palestinians don't have the right kind of power to change the world. But what I am critical, and in this book is quite critical of the Palestinians as well as critical of the Israelis. We haven't really talked about that, but they've never been realistic about the situation that they're in vis-a-vis their power. They were not realistic. I mean, they would have had to see the future. In the 1920s, when they were offered a permanent majority by the British, they were not realistic when they refused to engage with the UN Special Committee on Palestine in 1947. They were not realistic when they refused to join the Camp David Accords under Jimmy Carter. They're not realistic when they turned down what was not that great an offer, but could have been built upon by Ehud Barak at Camp David.
At Taba, right? Yeah.
Well, Taba,
Yeah.
then that was never really on offer, but the one at Camp David was by Barak. Wasn't a great offer. It wasn't nearly as great as people say it was, but it was something that could be built on. And instead, they just walked away. They've never been good at politics. They demand what they understand to be complete justice when they have no power behind that demand. So they get nothing. Now, before we go, I want to say something sympathetic about the Palestinians. Their leaders are in an impossible position because on the one hand, they have these people that I just talked about in the refugee camps who are living with open sewers and no education, and they don't have enough food. It's horrific. Then there's all these Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank. Then there's these Palestinians living under discriminatory laws in Israel. Then there's Palestinians working across the Arab world. Then there's some Palestinians living lovely lives, you know, in Europe and the United States. And it's impossible. And then there's the entire Arab world that claims the right to Jerusalem and the Holy Land. When Arafat was thinking about whether or not to accept Barak's offer, he was told by the Egyptians and the Saudis, you are absolutely not allowed to accept this offer because you're not getting all of Jerusalem. And he would have been killed if he had accepted it, most likely. So it's actually impossible to bring all these constituencies together for a yes. You can keep them together for a no, but you can't keep them together for a yes. So I would say that's one of the reasons why, even if Israel had the best intentions in the world, it wouldn't be able to make peace with the Palestinians. Now, that doesn't justify the way Israel acts towards the Palestinians, which is a long way from making peace with them. But I would say that the Palestinians bear some responsibility for their situation because they've never been able to embrace the relative power dynamic between themselves and the Israelis.
Okay. Yeah, I have two more questions. Unfortunately, we do, Eric, have to bring this long and really informative discussion to an end. It's been excellent. Yeah, I want to come back to the American Jewish diaspora, the non-Orthodox component, which is 90% of the American Jewish diaspora. You have in Israel that has become, again, has been an occupier for 55 years. There's not very much, as you point out, to younger Jews that's attractive about Israel. Why, indeed, as a Jew, should one continue to support Israel other than, as I would put it, sheer tribalism, ethnic solidarity, and commitment? What is there that appeals at this point or should appeal? And how should one, as an American Jew concerned about Israel, what type of stance should one take? What should one, if one wants to be an activist, do something about it?
Well,
How would you answer that?
you know, tribalism is not nothing. Tribalism is to some degree what makes the world go round.
Okay.
So and by the way, another word for the Jews that we Jews often use is the tribe, right?
Of course.
Right. So I mean, you see it on Larry David. Larry David is not, you know, but he's an American Jew. He's an ultra American Jew, but he talks about the tribe. There are people who I admire, American Jews, who say that we as American Jews are implicated in what Israel does, and we have a responsibility both to our own senses of ourselves as moral beings, but also to those people in Israel who are fighting the fight, to help them in any way we can. And therefore, we should not walk away from Israel. We should engage even more. I was at the J Street conference recently, and that was the line they took, and they meant it, and I admire them for it. I personally think it's hopeless. I think that the American Jewish experience and the Israeli Jewish experience are very different, and they've become. We share a lot in common, and there are a lot of Israelis I like and admire a great deal, but that country is going in a different direction than the country. Than a country I can support. They've just had 5 elections. They've told me 5 times in a row, I don't care about your values. I don't care about peace with the Palestinians. I don't care about liberalism. This is what I care about. I believe them now, okay? And as I said, I think American Jewry, which is what I am, has paid an enormous price for its obsession with Israel. So, and the third important part of my argument of this book, it's not an argument so much as it's an illustration, is that Israeli Jews don't care what American Jews think. They have contempt for American Jewish life, and they have contempt certainly for American Jewish practices, and they're just as happy to get the support of the conservative Christians. And this goes way back to the beginning, when Yitzhak Rabin was the ambassador to the United States. He endorsed Nixon in 1972, and the Republican Party made a big deal of this. And this was when ambassadors were never supposed to say anything, but he ignored all that. And when Golda Meir came to the country, she was his boss. She was the prime minister. A bunch of liberal rabbis said, "You got to rein in your ambassador and tell him to stop saying nice things about Nixon." And she said to them, "Where are your phantom jets?" Same thing that Stalin said. How many troops has the Pope? So the Israelis and Netanyahu and his recent I think it was Ron Dermer, if I'm not mistaken, and may be mistaken about that, but I think it was Ron Dermer who said, we don't need American Jews anymore. The conservative Christians are plenty. We're just fine with their support. American Jews are a pain in the ass. So I'm obviously paraphrasing, but so American Jews have basically given over their identities as Jews to the cause of the state of Israel. And again, the sacralization of the Holocaust, which is intimately related to the cause of the state of Israel. And they've paid a big price for it. And I think it was certainly an understandable price, and probably a price worth paying, if you want my opinion, in the 1940s. There were 250,000 Jewish refugees who survived the Holocaust, and they had nowhere to go. And the British wouldn't let them in, and the United States wasn't going to let them in. And the only place they could go was to a Palestine that was controlled by the Yishuv, which is the name for the Jewish community. And if it took the state of Israel to do that, I'm all for it. It's the only solution for those people. So I would have supported the state of Israel, knowing what I know now back then, even with all the problems that it's caused. But today, I think that Zionism is not playing a constructive role for American Jews anymore. I think that the American Jewish organizations are doing a real disservice to the future of American Jews by doubling down on it. And I think, I think it's not a lost cause. I do think Israeli liberalism, both in the political sense, like a liberal nation, but also political liberalism, like most Jews share, is a lost cause. Something could happen that could change everything. You know, history is unpredictable. Maybe something will happen, but as the way things are going, I don't see any hope at all for American Jews being able to influence Israel into a direction that is more consistent with American Jewish values and culture. And in the meantime, I think they should look into ways to saving themselves.
Well, okay, let me ask. It's difficult to end a conversation like this on a note of hopelessness. I'm wondering whether, Eric, you see anything within Israel itself, having just installed a reactionary government that's actually very frightening. Do you see any dynamics? I think in the last election, the Labor Party, which was the founding party, won only 3 seats in the Knesset. Meretz didn't win any seats. The liberal wing in Israeli politics seems to be snuffed out or virtually gone. The younger constituency is moving further to the right. Is there any signs of hope? I realize that, you know, you're a historian, and I guess I'm asking you to be a prophet, but I'm wondering whether you see any signs of hope within the Israeli polity itself that might begin to move it in an opposing direction again. Is there anything there on the landscape? I don't, at the moment, I don't see it, and I wish I did. I'm wondering if you do.
When you ask me to be a prophet, I always think of this other prophet who said so. The slow ones now will later be fast. The present now will later be past. But I don't think the times there are changing in a good way. Israeli young people are more right wing than Israeli old people, and
Yeah.
American Jewish young people are more left wing than their grandparents and
Yes.
parents.
Yes.
So look, I think Haaretz is one of the greatest newspapers in the world. It's definitely, as far as I know, the best place to get information about Israel and Palestine as well. Much better than the New York Times, much better than Le Monde, much better than the Guardian, even though I get a lot of information from those places too. Its circulation in Israel is about 6%. Okay, that's the Israeli left. That's the Israel that you and I grew up with, Amos Oz and Yehuda Amichai and Abba Eban. That's what's left of it, 6%. So so you can put your faith in that 6% if you want, but I would rather work with what I understand to be reality. Now, if you insist on me being optimistic about something,
Yes.
the way I deal with that, usually every book I write, I get this question, and I never, you know, when I would give a talk, people say, "What can we in this room do about this problem?" And I'm like, "Nothing, nothing to be done." But no, it's what I say, that it's a moment for American Judaism to reconsider its priorities, to think about what its future should be, and to invest in that future. I personally am investing in that future in a lot of ways that are personal that I don't want to discuss here. But I have moved my financial support from Israeli peace groups that I used to support when I used to consider myself a liberal Zionist. And it's not that I've changed, it's that I am looking at reality and saying there's no hope for a two-state solution, and I don't want to waste my time. And at the same time, I'm looking at my own community that I actually belong to. I teach at Brooklyn College. I'm a New Yorker. New York is my country, and Jews are my people. Jewish history is my history, and I'm saying, well, there's maybe some useful role I can play here. This book is maybe part of that. Maybe it's all of it. But I think that schism will open up opportunities to think this way, and that maybe this can be a moment where we look back and we say, this is when American Jewry began to rejuvenate itself. That's
Okay.
my optimistical.
Eric Alterman, thank you so very much. I again just want to let our viewing public know about your book. We Are Not One. I have it here. It's over 500 pages long. It is eminently readable. It is a compendium of everything you need to know in terms of Israel-American relationships, the American Jewish diaspora community, its relationship with Israel, all the details and facts. I don't think you left out a single thing. It was really quite an extraordinary labor of love, and I really commend this book to anyone who is concerned about Israel, the American Jewish community, and so on, the Middle East, and so on and so forth. It's really a marvelous achievement, Eric Altman.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations on this
I
book,
really
and it's
appreciate it.
really been a pleasure talking to you, and
Thank you.
I wish we could have continued this discussion for another 4 or 5 hours. Okay, you take care. You be well and have a good year.
Thank you.
Okay,
You too.
okay,
Bye bye.
okay. Thank you,
Thanks
everyone
to
who's
everyone
tuned
involved.
in.